In this unit, we are going to be looking at hereditary genetics. So basically that means that we're going to be studying why you have the different traits that you have. What were some of the genes that were passed on from your parents that then lead to the development of certain traits? There's some background information that you need to remember from the previous unit. We learned that humans, our diploid number is 46. So that means in each of your cells, for the most part, there's some cells that have an exception, like red blood cells don't have nuclei anymore. But most of your cells are going to have 46 chromosomes, and 23 of those come from your mom, and 23 come from your dad. You've seen a picture like this before. This is a picture of someone's chromosomes. This is called a karyotype. And in the human karyotype, chromosomes 1 through 22 have a special name. So let's block off 1 through 22. And they are called the autosomes, or we say 1 through 22 are the autosomal chromosomes. That 23rd pair that we see here is different. Those are called the sex chromosomes. There's two types of sex chromosomes, the X and the Y, and you'll need to remember that XY is the guy, and then females are two X's. We have these chromosomes paired up in the karyotype, and you can always assume that in a karyotype, one of these chromosomes is from mom, and the other that it's paired up with is the one that's from dad. So again, you get 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 from dad. The fact that these are paired up is a reason why that we say that these two chromosomes you see there in spot 1 are considered homologous chromosomes. Another way to say that is these two chromosomes, and even like these two that we see here and these two that we see here, they are homologs, or they're homologous chromosomes. So what that means is that they have the exact same genes on them. Every human has chromosome 1, and chromosome 1 has the exact same genes on it for every person in the human population. As a matter of fact, there's a poster hanging up in my room, and you can see all the genes that are located on chromosome 1. So if you get a chromosome 1 from mom and a chromosome 1 from dad, those chromosomes are going to have the exact same genes on them. Now, these genes can exist in different forms. So let's make sure you understand what I mean by that. Here is chromosome. Let's say here's chromosome number 1 from mom, and here's chromosome number 1 from dad. The genes are the same. So if we look in this area of the chromosome, an exact same area in dad's chromosome, we're going to see the same gene is located there. So this gene is for hairline. So this is the hairline gene. And some of you have already talked a little bit about hairline because we can have a widow's peak, or some people have a straight hairline. So that's the hairline gene. From what I just told you, you can see that there can be different codes on that gene. Some people inherit a code for widow's peak. So let's put widow's peak. And the different forms of this gene, and for all genes, are called alleles. So for mom, you inherited an allele for that gene that codes for widow's peak. Over here, let's say from dad, he passed on a chromosome that contains an allele for straight hairline. So let's put straight line allele. That's what I mean by alleles, are the different forms of the same gene. So for example, for a gene for eye color, there can be different alleles. People could have different codes within that gene. Some people are going to have an allele that codes for light eyes, like blue or green. Some people are going to inherit an allele that codes for dark eyes, like brown. For tongue rolling, the gene is related to tongue rolling, but you can have an allele to roll your tongue, and some people have alleles for non-tongue rolling. They can't roll their tongue. Now, to represent the codes that you inherit, your genes, we're going to use letters of the alphabet to represent that. And I caution students, whenever you get to pick which letter to use, try to use letters that do not look the same, uppercase and lowercase. So, for example, I could use a W over here, but it might be difficult for you to tell whether I wrote a capital W or a lowercase w. So we want to stay away with letters like this. I'm going to use the letter I because capital I and lowercase I look different from one another. So I'm going to let the capital I represent this allele right here that codes for widow's peak. And I'm going to use, since it's the same gene, I'm going to use the same letter here. Actually, I'm going to write it right here. And I'm going to use a lowercase I to represent the allele or the form that is found on dad's chromosome. These two letters that represent what genes you possess or what alleles you possess are called your genotype. So if I say identify the genotype, you're going to write things like this. Big I, big I. So some people have two alleles that they inherited, both for widow's peak. Some people got an allele for widow's peak, and their other one codes for straight hairline. And there's some individuals in our population that all they inherited from their parents is to have a straight hairline. So there would be little I, little I. Now, the phenotype, so again, that was the genotype. The phenotype is the physical trait that we actually see. So the physical trait is called the phenotype. I want you to circle P for phenotype and P for physical trait. So remember that the physical trait is the phenotype. What I mean by that is the physical trait in this situation would be widow's peak and straight. Those are the two physical characteristics that we see that go with these alleles of this gene. Now that you got some background as to our chromosomes that we inherit to from each parent, so we're going to have two letters for every trait. That's going to be our genotype. We're going to go into the three types of inheritances. So there's three main types of inheritances, and you're going to deal with these every single day in this unit. The first type of inheritance is called complete dominance. In this situation, we're going to have two alleles, just like we showed you above, and one allele we say is dominant. That means the other one is called the recessive allele. And the reason why we call one the dominant allele is because if someone has a dominant and a recessive allele, the dominant one will completely cover it up. It's like they don't even have the recessive allele. To represent the dominant one, we always want to use a capital letter. That's going to tell you when you're working these problems that that's going to be the dominant trait that's going to mask the other one. So for example, with eyelash length, so they can have long eyelashes or short eyelashes. Since long lashes are dominant to short lashes, I'm giving you that information right here, then we're going to use a capital L to represent an allele for long eyelashes. And we're going to use the same letter, a lowercase l, to represent the allele that codes for short lashes. So if we know that someone has two chromosomes and both code or both have alleles for long lashes, the genotype of this person would be big L, big L. Remember, genotype is the letters that represent the genes or the alleles that you inherited. The phenotype is the physical. What we would see long lashes. Of course, in science, we give everything 2 to 3 names to confuse you. So here is a word that you have to become familiar with. Otherwise, you can't do most of the work from here on out. If I say a person is homozygous dominant for a trait, you have to know to write 2 capital letters for this person's genotype. So let's break down what we mean by homozygous dominant. The prefix homo means the same, and the fact that we put dominant behind it means make those letters big. Capitalize them. So if I say a person is homozygous dominant, you know their 2 letters are the same. They have 2 of the same alleles, and you're going to keep them capitalized because I said dominant. We can also say they're pure for the trait. So the only codes that they have is the same code. They're pure for the trait. Whereas someone who has 2 codes, 2 different codes, like big L, little l, so they have a code for long and a code for short, we call them a hybrid. They're like a combination. Or we can call them a carrier, or the opposite of homo is hetero. So we say the person is heterozygous for the trait. So if I say a person's heterozygous or I say they're a carrier, you have to know to write a big and a small letter for their genotype. But since long is dominant to short, then this person is still going to have long lashes, because it's like that dominant one, lashes. It's like the dominant one will completely cover up the recessive allele. And then finally, if a person has two of the recessive alleles, so it could be little l, this is the only way to have short lashes. You have to get two recessive alleles to show the recessive phenotype. In this case, the recessive phenotype is short, because long covers up short. And kind of the fancy scientific way to say this is those two letters are the same, so we're going to say homozygous. We're going to say recessive. So that means give them the same letters and then make them lowercase. So again, the first type of inheritance you need to become familiar with is when the two alleles show dominant and recessiveness. So we say the trait shows complete dominance. One is completely dominant to the other. In some situations, though, the alleles don't show complete dominance. They show incomplete dominance to one another. If this is occurring, then when we look at the heterozygote, remember the heterozygote is the one that has two different letters, two different alleles. The heterozygote will look like a mixture, or sometimes it's called a blend. Sometimes it's called, actually we already have blend there, so I'm going to erase that and go back here. A mixture, maybe. I'm just going to mark through it here and put an intermediate, which means kind of a middle. An intermediate or a middle of the two. Let's go through an example with this. In pea plants, for their flower color, flowers exist, or there's two alleles in the population. One allele codes for red, and the other allele codes for white flowers. Now, we're going to write our letters differently, and this is how I teach my students. I'm not going to give one capital and lowercase, because the red can't cover up the white, and the white can't cover up the red. They're incomplete to one another. One is not dominant to the other. So I'm going to use an R to represent red, and I'm going to put this little mark behind it, which is prime. Okay? And then for white, I'm going to just use an R with no prime. And it doesn't matter. You could have given the R, just the R, and then the white, the R prime. It doesn't matter. But I'm going to use the same letter, and one codes for red and one comes for white. If a plant is homozygous red, then from that information right there, you should know that they are R prime, R prime. And their phenotype is they're going to have red flowers. If a plant is heterozygous, because plants are like you, they're diploid, they have two codes for every trait, one from each parent, then that means that they have a code for red. So they have a code for red for this allele, and the other allele is coding for white. And what we end up seeing is a mix of the two. We get pink flowers. So they would have one of each code. So they'd be R, R prime. And then if they have two codes for white, so here's an allele that codes for white, here's an allele that codes for white, obviously they're going to develop with white flowers. And our symbol for white is R, so we would put that. So that is the second type of inheritance. Whenever you have an intermediate and the heterozygous individual, which we see right here, is like a mix. So let's put like a mix or middle or an intermediate of the two codes that it possesses. There's no allele that codes for pink because they have a red allele and they have a white allele. And so both get expressed and you end up with that middle color. And then finally, the third type of inheritance is called codominance. Think what that prefix co means. Like if you have co-captains, then you have two and they have equal power. So codominance means you're going to have two alleles and they both are going to dominate. They will not get covered up by the other one. A classic example is with a disease related to red blood cells. Red blood cells carry your oxygen. This disease is called sickle cell anemia. Now, the majority of us in our population, in our classroom, we're going to have two codes for normal. And there's some people that have an allele or a code for sickled red blood cells. Now, when I'm choosing my letters, I'm going to use capital letters because they're both dominant. And I'm going to have to change up the letter of the alphabet. So for normal, I'm just going to put an N to represent an allele that codes for normal. And I'm going to use an S to represent an allele that codes for these sickled red blood cells. And what I mean by that is your red blood cells should look like this. So let's put this as a RBC, a red blood cell, and this is a normal red blood cell. They should be rounded. And a sickled red blood cell, the hemoglobin in it is different, that protein inside the red blood cell, and it turns those red blood cells into something that resembles a sickle. So this is your sickled red blood cells. And these red blood cells will snag in your veins, in your arteries, and they'll get tangled, and it leads to blood clots and lack of circulation, and it can lead to pain in your extremities and a lot of other symptoms because it also damages your organs because these can destroy your blood vessels as they move through them. So let's go through the different genotypes and phenotypes that we have in our population. When we have individuals that are homozygous for normal, then that means their genotype is they're going to have 2 codes for normal. And obviously their phenotype is normal RBCs, red blood cells. So all you're going to see in their veins are normal red blood cells. Let's go down for homozygous, for sickled red blood cells. So homozygous means they have the same 2 alleles. And this is how we get that sickle red blood cell. So let's put sickle red blood cells. All they have for blood is those sickled shapes. And then finally, heterozygous for the trait means they have a normal code and a code for sickle red blood cells. Now, both are going to show up in codominance. It's codominance if the heterozygote shows both traits. So when we analyze the blood of these individuals, we're going to see normal red blood cells because they have a code for normal, and we see sickled cells. And these sickled look just as sickled as these, and these normal look just as normal as this. It's not like a middle of the two. If this trait did show incomplete dominance, then we would see something that was just like a middle of the two. I'd call that a middle. And all of the red blood cells would look like, you know, half a piece of pie or half of a pie. That's not the case. So since we see both in the heterozygous individual, then we say this trait shows codominance.